Well, despite all that, we are still seeing this global warming scare that's managed to convince the government and Labor to slash our emissions, and at a huge cost. I mean, just check your electricity bills. Now, the government's response to the scare has been the National Energy Guarantee, which includes, for instance, making the country's 100 biggest electricity users buy backup power if our electricity system runs short. If the wind, for instance, doesn't blow and turn the wind farms that we're trying to use more of instead. Now, a number of Liberal backbenchers don't think this will do anything really to cut our power prices, and former Prime Minister Tony Abbott today threatened to vote against this in Parliament.
The short answer is yes. I think that I have an obligation to keep faith with the position that the government took to the people in 2013.
Now, that commitment Abbott mentioned there was to scrap the carbon tax. That was a promise he made, and he says this new policy of Malcolm Turnbull is once more about cutting emissions rather than cutting prices. Now, to head off this unrest among several backbenchers, Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg today briefed business leaders and also government MPs who are worried about this policy. Now, one of those MPs was Abbott, as you saw, was clearly not convinced. Another was Kevin Andrews, a former minister who joins me now. Kevin Andrews, thanks so much for your time. Did the briefing today convince you that the National Energy Guarantee will cut electricity prices?
Well, the National Energy Guarantee, Andrew, is a framework document. It's a work in progress. The detail is still to be worked out at the Commonwealth level and between the Commonwealth and the states. So we are not yet arrived at the position where we know what the final format of the National Energy Guarantee will be coming from the COAG meeting. Today's meeting was more about hearing from the business community about their concerns, and I think also in telling the business community what some of the concerns of members of Parliament are about this matter.
Now, Kevin, obviously, now you've got the benefit of this extra briefing because you doubt this scheme as much or more than I don't know. Can you answer then for me the puzzle that I mean, I've looked at it. How is it actually supposed to cut electricity prices?
Well, this is the issue that many of my colleagues, along with myself, are concerned about. There are three aspects or three objectives, if you like, of the NEG. One is the emissions target, the Paris Agreement. The second one is the reliability of supply, which Australians are very concerned about, particularly following the blackouts in South Australia and, you know, close to it in other places. But the third element is the actual price. And what Australians say to me wherever I go around this country is they're concerned about the price of electricity. My local welfare organisation in my electorate has told me recently of elderly people, pensioners in my electorate, staying in bed during the day because they can't afford to turn on heating. So we've got to address the price, and that's what I think the great majority of my colleagues are concerned about. It was certainly a matter which was mentioned in this briefing this morning by numerous colleagues. We really need a price target as well as an emissions target and a reliability target.
Yeah, but even theoretically, Kevin, even if you don't accept it or you do accept it, I don't know, theoretically, how is it supposed to work? What's the switch between this National Energy Guarantee, right, which forces the 100 top companies to go and buy some backup power in case the lights dim? What's the link between that and your power bills going down? I don't get it.
Well, the modelling shows, according to the Minister, that with the National Energy Guarantee, with certainty in terms of what can be expected by way of investment, etc., with addressing other issues such as the cost of power transmission, that the cost of energy in the future will be less than it would have been otherwise. Now, I think that's a fair argument. I don't have an argument as such with the National Energy Guarantee. As I said, it's a framework document, and we'll have to see what the final details are before we can draw a final conclusion about it. What I'm concerned about is to ensure that the price of electricity in Australia is as low as possible. And secondly, Jennifer Westacott, the head of the Business Council of Australia, said to us this morning, what we've got to ensure is that we maintain our baseload electricity generation in Australia, that we need to do things like refurbish existing coal-fired power stations, and we will need to build more coal-fired power stations in the future, because we know that renewables, the head of BlueScope told us this morning, there's not the technology there to be able to rely on renewables. Wind and solar are great when the wind's blowing and the sun is shining, but if it's not, you've got to be able to provide peak load electricity, and that means gas and coal are going to be the base load for decades to come.
Yeah, you're quite true. I looked at the National Energy Market Operators website, and the wind today almost died to a zephyr in South Australia and Victoria, almost no wind power at all, and they had to rely on the coal-fired power stations in Queensland again. But Kevin, only 4 Coalition MPs spoke against this policy or raised doubts about this policy in the party room meeting today. Tony Abbott, Erica Betts, Barnaby Joyce, Craig Kelly. 4 is not much of a sort of rump, is it? I mean, it seems like there's almost like an exhaustion going on. Well, everyone will just go with the flow and stop creating trouble for the Prime Minister.
Well, many more colleagues spoke in the private briefing we had this morning, Andrew, and I can understand why people might be of the view that I've made my point, heard this morning in the earlier meeting, and also we ran out of time in terms of the meeting because the Parliament was starting. So there are some other extraneous issues around that. But can I say to you that if I can, as honestly as possibly reflect what I believe the view or the mood of the party room is, yes, the NEG is a framework document. We're all waiting to see what the details come out of COAG on that is. But secondly, it's our absolute commitment to want to see the cheapest possible prices, and that's an important issue. And some of us believe we should have at least some aspirations about what that price should be. But thirdly, if this is going to work in the future and we're going to retain our international competitiveness, we're going to have to refurbish and indeed build coal-fired and gas-fired power stations as the backup to provide the baseload electricity. If you don't do that, then we're not going to be competitive and we're not going to supply electricity.
Kevin, though, you said you want the power prices to be as low as they can be. Well, obviously, the only way really to do that, if you really meant it, would be to tear up these stupid promises on the Paris Agreement, promises that do not bind the world's biggest emitters, China and India. They're okay to keep increasing their emissions. America has walked out. That leaves tiny little Australia, responsible for a tiny fraction of the world's emissions, busily trying to save the world, not quite single-handedly, but you know what I mean. I want to ask you whether there's any reason at all for us to be doing all this emissions slashing. Do you believe that human emissions truly are heating the world dangerously?
Well, you had an expert on before me, and he knows more about the detail of this than any member of Parliament does. But the reality is, if you look at the charts for the last decade or two, there's been a plateau in terms of global warming. So there hasn't been the predicted outcome from some of the so-called experts of 20, 30 years ago that they said this was going to lead to a catastrophe. There's an argument, certainly among scientists, that we could face global cooling rather than global warming in the future. Having said that, Australia is probably going to meet the Paris targets in any event, but you have to wonder, would we enter into such an agreement now, knowing that the biggest emitters in the world are not part of it?
Kevin, I just keep asking, why are we doing something that is useless about a scare that's been wildly exaggerated? It seems like there's a collective madness and too few people are speaking up. It's like we're living the Emperor's new clothes for real, but there's no little boy in the room to say he's naked. But Kevin, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.